Welcome, everyone. This election season, the North Pacific Ministry of Radio is sponsoring a series of voice chat and text-based town halls for each candidate. We hope this event is informative, and we encourage you to participate by asking questions in the chat. And now, let's get started. Welcome, Robespierre.
Pleasure to be here.
Could you give us a brief history on yourself within the region and a history of positions that you've held in the regional government?
Yeah, certainly. So, my journey into TNP began on the 2nd of May in 2019. Within my first week in TNP, I was approached by three ministers at the time, Marcus Antonius, Palath, otherwise known as Ghost, and T-Bombs, to become their deputy ministers. So I started out my first week in TNP as a deputy minister in three different ministries, and then I sort of progressed from there. Within the first month of LPG Grande's term as delegate, Marcus Antonius unfortunately had to be replaced due to real-life reasons. He wasn't able to be as active as he needed to be for the role, and as his deputy minister, I was promoted, if you will, to the minister position. So I started out my journey in TNP really as a deputy minister in three different ministries, but I became the Minister of Home Affairs. And that was kind of my initiation, if you will, into the executive branch and the executive council. I finished up my term under Fiji and was then asked by the new delegate, which was McMacedonia, or McMacedonia, depending on how you pronounce his name, to become a minister. I became his Minister of Defense because during my time as MOHA, I had been pretty active in the North Pacific Army and actually became Minister of Defense without previously being a Deputy Minister of Defense. And I was given the role of MOD when I was just a lieutenant in the North Pacific Army. I just reached the rank of lieutenant, and when you become Minister of Defense, you temporarily get the rank of general. So I became a general of the NPA before I technically was even a captain of it or a major of it. Love it. So that was a fun little tidbit. But nowadays, I really am a general of the North Pacific Army regularly, not just for when I'm MOD. I was appointed by, this is a little bit of a time skip ahead, but I was appointed by MCM earlier this year in February to become a general of the North Pacific Army on a more, semi-regular, although not permanent, but semi-regular basis. So without being MOD, I really am a general in the NPA nowadays. After my term as Minister of Defense, kind of cycling back to the continuation of that, I was elected as vice delegate in a race which I ran against Oracle, or otherwise known as Artemis. He was the incumbent at the time, and I ran against him, and I won. But it was a pretty hotly contested race, pretty narrow victory, but I did win. I did beat an incumbent, and I became the vice delegate, which I served until March. And then, after I left the vice delegacy, after my exit from the vice delegacy, I really transitioned sort of over to the legislative branch, became a deputy speaker under Speaker Madjak for 2 terms. And after Madjak moved on to the executive as Minister of Culture, I became the Speaker of the Regional Assembly, which is the position that I hold now. Until the 11th, anyway, because I'm no longer running for re-election. Instead, I'm running for delegate. It's kind of sprinkled in. I became an ambassador to some regions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I became a senior WA consultant after I was a deputy minister in WA. I've become a senior diplomat in the time since, and I even won the 2019 Best Newcomer Award for the Leonards. So that's kind of a summary of all my accomplishments or accolades or positions or whatever you want to call it.
Why did you decide to run for delegate?
So, obviously, whenever you consider running for such high public office, there are a number of motivating factors. It's not just in sole part due to one reason. I've kind of seen this term that, one of the big things going into January was that MCM wanted to come back to set the executive right and to do things and give us the high level of service that we've come to expect from previous administrations. And throughout this term, I've kind of observed some places in which we could, be doing better and delivering that level of service. And so the whole thing about my campaign is that we want to give new life to the executive, breathe a new energy into it, and we want to, serve at the highest level possible. And I sort of feel called upon to do that because as, a part of the newer generation of TNPers, if you will, I think now is a great generational shift in a way. It's a time for us to step up and really go to bat for this region's future because, although MCM has served, dutifully in the past, he can't always be here, and former delegates can't always be here to, set the ship right. So it really is time for us to elect someone new who has fresh, innovative ideas, and for us to really start heading in a new direction as far as what perspective our delegate has. So, I'm there for that reason.
How will you continue or change the executive staff moving forward from McMasterdonia's delegacy?
Yeah, so that's a pretty good question. As delegate, obviously, I will be tasked with the overall management of the executive staff. It's something that I would have the final say on. And, I mentioned in the general administration portion of my campaign section, if you will, that I really want to continue processing applicants in a timely manner. I feel that sometimes when we're a game created region and, nations spawn here just by virtue of that, I feel as though sometimes, we get caught up in this idea that we don't have to really do much because nations will come to us. Well, it really is time for us to come out to them and really assist them and usher them in, if you will. So when people apply to the executive staff, we need to be timely in processing those applications. I specified the 48-hour limit, 72 hours max. I would like everything to be processed within the first 2 days of someone applying, possibly earlier. And that's standard I've really set myself to, coming from a speakership background. I understand the importance of timeliness, and I understand that there should be some urgency when we do that sort of thing. Because in the speaker's office, we perform checks daily. We do everything on a very set schedule, and I think the executive needs that. It needs people who have that sense of urgency to take interested people and bring them into the executive staff to where they're not just left to their own devices and wondering, when am I going to be accepted? What am I supposed to do here? Like, once they get into the executive staff, we really need that, one-on-one support. The ministers really need to communicate with the staffers in a way that encourages them to get involved, encourages them to fulfill their potential, and encourages them to really become a part of our community and a contributing part of our community more so. So the changes that I would make to the executive staff are really all about, lowering the bar for people to get involved, making sure that our executive server is a hotbed of activity, making sure that, it's an active place that people are spending time in and they have things to pay attention to, they have things to do. And I think overall, I just want to bring that sense of excitement or, inspiration. I want to bring that sense of excitement back to people about what their government's doing for them. So I feel like that's something that I can definitely have an impact in and be a force for change.
Quickly do you believe you can execute on your campaign goals?
Absolutely. I know that a number of things that I mentioned in there are, it's very detailed and there's a lot of things that we go over. But a lot of these things, I've been thinking about for well over a month now. And I kind of know how I want to approach them by now. This is definitely a planned run. This wasn't a spur of the moment. And I think that's what you want. And I think you kind of saw it exhibited with how quickly I posted my campaign and got my message out there. I definitely did plan it, and I definitely do intend to follow up with it. It's something that I've believed in for months now, and it's something that I'm really running so that I can execute it, and so that I have, the authority to stand on of getting things done, kind of like I have in the speaker's office, kind of like I have as an MOD, and before that, I really just want to get things done, make sure that we're delivering that high level of service, and I absolutely believe in everything that my campaign says.
Thing do you what one thing do you think that you have that is seen as by you as an advantage over your competitor, Nemaria?
I definitely think, and there's actually a third person entering the race, I believe, who's running as a joke candidate. But
Yes.
my primary opponent is Namaria. I think that I definitely bring a lot more experience to the table as far as serving an elected office. I've done so before, most notably as speaker. You've seen my approach as a speaker this term. You've seen the attention to detail. You've seen how I run a well-oiled machine. You've seen how I'm able to be an administrator in that regard, a facilitator of activity. You've seen how I've been able to keep my deputies and develop new talent in the office. And that's something I want to do with the executive council. I really want to make sure it's a well-oiled machine. I want to make sure that we're developing talent within the executive staff, and I have the experience to back that up. I have reputable experience in this region. I've been for everything from a minister to a deputy minister to a staffer myself, and I've kind of had that goal. As far as what I have over in Ameria, it's definitely I have the perspective. I have the preparation, I have the energy, I have the time to commit to it, and I definitely think that the way I want to do things is more, it's a methodical, measured approach, and I think that's what we really need so that we can give our ministries clear direction. So I think that that would be the main thing that you would elect me for, the main thing that you would want to elect me for, because right now we need ministries that have clear objectives and ideas that can push us forward into the future, and I think I, as a candidate, offer that.
What is what is your main focus for this election? You have a large amount of ideas that you're bringing to the table, but what is your main idea that you want to bring?
My main idea is the exact same as my campaign slogan. It's rejuvenation. Old energy isn't bad, but it's not the same as new energy. And if we really want to commit to the future of TNP, we need to understand that the old way of doing things it's kind of phased out. We've been down that route. It's worked for us, but it's no longer working for us. So we really need to make sure that we kind of cultivate that new talent, develop it, bring in new ideas to the table, and really look to the future of that generational shift for the new generation, the new blood of TNP are stepping up. My main focus for this election is to bring that new energy, inspire people again to get excited about what we're doing, and change the way we do things for the better.
What is your opinion on the current on the whole situation with the South Pacific, a long-time ally, and recently have broken off diplomatic communication with us?
I think that there are a number of fundamental differences that separate us from the South Pacific, but they are an allied region nonetheless. And I think that's definitely a tone setter for how we interact with them and in what regard we hold them into. I know that in January, MCM advocated for a more assertive, let our voice be heard approach, kind of a hardline stance to it. Not aggressive per se, but assertive, I would say is the right word. And I sort of think with the handling of the TSP situation, we were almost assertive to our detriment. But to be fair, I think their demands, from what I know of the situation, their demands were entirely reasonable. But I think we should have approached it, hey, we're treated allies, as opposed to, hey, you're a region that did something that we don't like. I'm not quite too pleased that there is a little bit of a wrinkle in our relationship nowadays, but I do think that they're headed off into a direction that we ourselves wouldn't be heading off into. And that doesn't mean that we always have to agree on everything as allies, but it does mean that we should treat each other with a certain regard. And I think on both accounts, both from the South Pacific and both from us, the situation could have been handled better. There could have been more diplomacy. There could have been more of like a mediation, if you will, for as far as we have our differences, but our alliance is important. So how can we show the wider NS community that we still stand together, even though we have our differences, and that we can put our differences aside for the benefit of our diplomatic relationship? I would have liked to see that be handled a bit better.
On your forum election post on where you announced your plans for your delegacy, you specified in your frequently asked questions on what regions do you think TNP should have a closer relationship with. Can you explain why did you choose these regions?
We definitely have this tendency, I believe, in our foreign affairs, like kind of an answer that I responded to someone when they asked the question of what our biggest diplomatic challenge was or what could be improved upon in that area. And the issue is that I feel like sometimes we look inward and focus on ourselves because we're such a leader in a multitude of fields that come within us, and we're such a leader in it that we think that the happenings of the NS community don't really affect us, so they're not gonna really reach the heights that will make an impact here. And I think that's a real shame because the NS community does have a lot to offer us, and I think that if we allow them to offer us, we can potentially reap the benefits of that. So when I talk about why we should, pursue closer relations with regions such as the UDS or Spiritus or Europe even, when in the WA Affairs section of my campaign where I talk about the initiative with Wall, that's really designed to help us, conversate, if that's the word for it, conversate with our allies, have discussions about with our allies in Wall. And I know that regions such as Europe and Europea will have a profound interest in discussing the activities of the General Assembly. Europe, in particular, with their leader, Imperium Magnolium, I know that that's something that they would be eager to participate in, so I know that that's a driving factor of how we can, better connect with our allies in Wall. Not to say that we're disconnected now, because we're not, but it's something that we can do to get closer to them. On the front with the UDS, which for those of you is the Union of Democratic States, for those of you who don't know, and Spiritus, personally, I've always found Spiritus to be a very welcoming and warm region. I know of their delegate, Spud Salaxians, and we worked with them in the Potato Alliance this past end day. And I'm very familiar with kind of their attitude to the wider NS community and how they view friendships, how they view diplomatic relations. So I feel like that would be a very good situation for us to enter into if we were to engage in diplomacy with them. And the UDS, I've always found UDS to be a nice up-and-coming UCR with a lot of friendly faces that we know from other regions, and I think that, again, they're a potential diplomatic partner who it would be the equivalent of us walking into a situation where we know relations are going to start out friendly. So I think that there's an opportunity there if we wanted to go down that route.
Gotcha. Seemingly on towards radio content for a little bit.
Yeah, go
Upon
ahead.
on interest of how radio integrated with culture, you seemingly have plans to make the Ministry of Radio work better with the Ministry of Cards. Why exactly do you think that we should work with cards instead of with cards together?
When I mentioned the potential to have card-centric content on NBS programming back in March, it was an idea that the people who were there at the time I proposed it really kind of took to. They're like, yes, that's something we should do. That's a good idea. And it really encouraged me to include that in my campaign. Because, with the recent issues that we've had in cards, programs grinding to a halt and cards not being sent out, people are not getting their benefits unless it's automated, which our lotteries are automated, but our gifting of cards for certain things are not automated. And unfortunately, I don't believe that MCM has the, time in real life to manually gift everyone their cards. So there's a solution that we needed to devise for that. But also, as far as where we can get cards from and the sources that we're going to be getting cards from, we need a way to educate people about card farming and how to obtain those cards. And we also need to incentivize them staying with us so that they can become TNP farmers in-house. And one way that you do that, as far as educating card farmers, is you give them tutorials. You give them resources that they can latch onto. Someone who doesn't know anything about card farming or someone who's confused about how to set up scripts, well, they can be helped by people in our community who do know how to set up those scripts, who do know, how to structure the puppets and how to organize them and do it the quickest way and most efficient way possible. But instead of those people having to take the initiative and ask our people how to do that, I would like to have those resources be readily available. And that's one reason that I think card farming tutorials would be an excellent addition to the NBS lineup. Because some people, they might be a bit shy. They might not want to be comfortable or not feel comfortable with asking the Minister of Cards, hey, how do I do this? Or asking even a Deputy Minister of Cards, hey, how do I do this? So it's a lot better if we have resources that we can point to them and say, hey, here's how it is. Here's what you can do, because we are really leaders in that aspect of things. We can really contribute, very, very solid quality resources like we have with DGES's comprehensive guide to NS cards. So I really think that there's an opportunity to build up not only our cards infrastructure, but also kind of add another layer to the NBS formula.
Understandable. What other ministry, if you had another choice, would you see better connecting to the Ministry of Radio, beyond side the Ministry of Cards?
I think we've done a lot of connections as far as the Ministry of Defense with our call to serve interviews. So I think we kind of have our bases covered as far as radio content related to defense. I do think that there's a potential for us to get out solid tutorials on raiding and defending. We have an advertisement video that Fiji produced that was called Join the North Pacific Army. That's kind of one of the examples I cited in my campaign for what, advertisements we have for certain initiatives. But I also think that we can do more to, again, provide resources for people who want to get into raiding and defending without necessarily needing to reach out to people or having the confidence to reach out to people who could help them. I think having those resources on demand is to their benefit. So I could definitely see, as far as Ministry of Defense, us adding those tutorials. But I also think that for the Ministry of Defense, there's only so much that you can guide people and tell them the theoretics of it. You also really need to participate in an op and kind of get a feel for it, because they're two different things. Theoretically, how do you update, but also realistically, practically, how do you update? So I think that there's kind of, two ways to go about that. And I think that, having the hands-on experience is preferable in that regard. As far as how we can kind of merge communications with radio, as many of you know, radio used to be part of communications, and I'm very in favor of the split with radio being its own ministry, because like I said, I really do believe in the greatness of radio, the potential for greatness in radio. So, I would obviously seek to keep them split. I think, for some of our Polaris publications, there's a lot of untapped potential for us to release new shows that coincide with the Polaris publication. Because the whole thing with Polaris is it gives us the flexibility to report on things right as they happen, And I think having, new shows to go along with that would be good, because let's say a lot of things are happening, which in this term, I hope that a lot of things do end up happening. Let's say, instead of reading a multi-paragraph Polaris essay, if you will, maybe you want to listen to a radio broadcast about it, so you can go about your normal day without needing to read. It kind of is in the same vein as podcasting, what people like to listen to things while they're doing other things in their day-to-day life to digest information. So I definitely see the potential for us to integrate Polaris with that. Lastly, I think, in the Ministry of Culture, I think, it's great that we've been uploading lectures from certain events that we've been hosting, such as the WA Symposium, and even, other lectures on the Roleplay Symposium and things of that nature. I think it's great that we've been uploading those to NBS. But I also think that when we host an event, and let's say, there's other regions participating in the event, bring some of those people on the NBS. Invite them to be broadcast and be heard. Connect with the other wider NS community with radio, and invite them on to NBS so that we are the producers, we are the broadcasters, and we are bringing minds from all across NS to our platform. And I think that that's definitely something that has value.
What is your leadership style like?
My leadership style is very hands-on. Once again, a measured approach. As any of my deputy speakers will tell you, I hold the office to a high standard, just like I would if I was elected and overseeing the executive. I hold things to a high standard. I expect things to be done in a certain way, and I'm very, I convey that way. I definitely don't leave it up to any ambiguity. I let you know up front the way I want things done, and I think that many can appeal to that. Having the structure, having the leadership, and in a way giving ministers direction. Not so much to where they can't do things on their own, but so much to where they know what targets they need to hit on, and whatever they're doing on a day-to-day basis is working towards hitting those targets. I'm definitely a provider of what our objectives are, and the ministers to help achieve those objectives. But I'll be very clear on that, and I'll be very hands-on, checking with them to make sure that we're heading in the right direction.
What will your administration do to improve life for each of our regional communities, from the executive staff to the North Pacific Army, and from our role players to the people on the RMB, Regional Message Board?
I've already spoken for the first question at length about the executive staff, so I'll just reiterate, lowering the bar for people to get excited and people to really become contributing members of the community. But more in depth on the other communities, I think roleplay, they enjoy functioning separate from the government, and I would not seek to impede on that or interfere with that. They're very well ran, very well managed, very well organized. I know that Pridania, Sil Dorset, the administration, Matt Jack over there, they do an excellent job with RP administration, and I don't think, it doesn't, not only does it not need any interference from the executive, but it also doesn't need me, overseeing or shadowing them or saying anything about it. I think that definitely functions, and the RPers are happy with, not having TNP Gov looming over. So I think that, radio or RP should continue to do what it does best, which is what RP does, and I'm very supportive of that community. For the NPA, I definitely think that we need to sell the successes of the NPA, which is something that MCM mentioned back in 2019 that we did during his first term. It's really making sure that what we're doing on the battlefield is being publicized and proudly touted. I think that when people see, hey, the NPA is doing things, serving the regional interest, but we're having fun, most importantly. When I was last Minister of Defense, fun is a huge part, because not only do we want a military who's well trained, active, and is able to execute, but we want people to enjoy their time there, and we want people to have fun. So I think, recruitment's a huge part of that, getting new people into the door, because there's a social aspect at play and a camaraderie aspect at play. But I think that NPAers really enjoy having a variety of ops. They enjoy, being social with one another. They enjoy that kind of brotherhood that comes with being in the NPA. And I think that, we definitely need to publicize that, advertise that, get people excited about that. Cards players, I've spoken a little bit about cards already, how I want to introduce new programs, make sure our programs are running, the ones that we currently do have, kind of do the internal audit, like I mentioned in my campaign, so we can see where everything's at, but also I want to make sure that people are getting their benefits in cards, where, maybe cards players join TNP because they're interested in cards, and that's all they're here for. Okay, well, we need to make sure that those people are being rewarded for doing what they're doing. And that's kind of plays into my plans for the deck development program, but also the card outreach program. Maybe you're not in TNP, but maybe you still have a vested interest in cards. That's a service that we can provide to the wider NS community, similar to how we have with the World Endorsement Tool. The more services that we're providing, the more opportunities for us to engage. What other communities did you mention? We've mentioned NPAers, executive staff, RP, cards players.
The regional message board
Oh,
people.
regional message. Thank you, regional message board. I know that I personally would be interacting with the R&B more. I think that it's a decent place, and it definitely has some of its faults. But so long as you ignore the trollish nations who are there to disrupt the flow of conversation, who are there to get people riled up, it really is a pleasant way for our region's members to talk and nations to interact with one another. And I'm glad that we have people who are dedicated to really fostering that controlled chaos that is the R&B, and our GAs do an excellent job of that. But I know that if elected delegate, I'll personally be engaging with the R&B, welcoming people to the region, posting more than I usually would. And I think that the R&B, I was asked a question by you actually about R&B regulation, and I really think that our R&B guidelines do a good job of that. But I also think that as far as regulation, we shouldn't. We don't want to be so stringent on our regulations that we disrupt that energy or we disrupt that flow of conversation. It's by no means a laissez-faire approach, but it's definitely something that should be paid attention to because game side, forum side, or otherwise, they are all part of the TNP community, and I want to be a delegate who's here for everyone.
The delegacy can come with a lot of stress and difficult decisions. How would you rate your own self-confidence?
On what scale?
On
1 to 5 stars, 1 to
one
10.
1 to 10.
About a 9. I'm feeling very confident about this. I've been in positions of regional leadership before, even before I came to TNP. I have lots of UCR experience and even experience from other GCRs. I'm very confident about being a decision maker and having to, be engaged and involved in the going-ons of the region and the happenings of it and taking it in the direction I want. I feel very confident in my ability to lead.
Several executive ministries suffer from high turnover or a shortage of staff. How would you work with your ministers to build up a core staff that is capable of meeting the government's needs?
Yeah, so this is actually something I've talked about. There's 2 different places that I can think of examples that I've mentioned this in my campaign so far. The first is when I believe it was Fregerson asked me if I believe it's the delegate or the minister's responsibility to bring up new talent in the executive staff, and I said it was both. Because even though, by extension, I'm responsible for what the ministers do, I also feel personally responsible because the executive staff is the delegate's, domain. I'm the overseer of that if I'm elected delegate, and it really is my responsibility. So I see it as both ministers and the delegate being responsible for cultivating new talent and developing it in a meaningful way. But I think that as far as, it all starts with recruitment, and that it really is what I said. Not only do you have to get more people in the door and get excited about what they're doing, but you have to lower that bar, like I talked about with executive staff applications, get people in the door, and then once they're in the door, you need to give them things that they can latch onto, things that they can involve themselves in, and have, clear expectations as far as what they're to do. The second example, as I mentioned specifically in the Ministry of Communications, when writing articles, which is something that communication staffers often do, they're not given a lot of direction beyond, please have your article in by this due date, and if that due date comes and goes and you don't turn it in, you might get a message saying, hey, where's this article? And there's really no conversation that takes place outside of those 2 messages. And again, I think this is a sin. I think that people should have, that one-on-one time with ministers and myself. I definitely want to involve myself in that. If I can be helpful to staffers, I will as the delegate, and I'd also like to be more personable. I want them to not fear coming to the delegate and asking questions or fear, looking foolish or something like that. I definitely think that staffers, once they're in the door and once they've been greeted warmly at the door, should have things to do, and they should be supported in contributing to our community. Oh yes, I'm looking at the Agora text, and Fiji says about my idea for card farming tutorials that it can be an excellent boost to cards education across NS as a whole. Absolutely, that's exactly what I'm talking about. When we're able to provide services to the wider NS community, that asserts our place as a leader. With the endorsement tool, we provided a service. With the cards outreach program, we are able to provide a service with the resources we have. And again, with the resources we have in radio, we can create those resources for other people, not just TNPers. That's another service that our region can provide, and I think that we should absolutely pursue that. Absolutely, there's definitely so much potential for growth. I 100% agree, Fiji. Yep, more things we can say is made in TNP. This reminds me of, thank you, Cupa. This reminds me of a little banner that I actually had you create when I was in the NPA that says, it's like a barcode and it says made in the NPA. Yes, more things made in TNP. More things made in the NPA. more things made in the Ministry of Radio, produced by NBS. Let's put our name on that. Let's get it out there.
Some people who are not able to access our forums for some reason. Could you give a brief description of the core points of your campaign?
The core points of my campaign. So the good news is that if you're unable to access the forum, I've actually provided a dispatch adaptation of my campaign that is the exact same campaign, the exact same wording, everything's detailed as it was when I posted it onto the forum, and nothing is omitted. So if you're unable to look on our forums, no problem. You can always look on my dispatch, and I will provide that dispatch if you'd like in the Agora channel. But I've definitely made it to where GameSide can definitely engage with what I'm saying. In fact, I'm not sure which day I'll do it, but I am planning to host an R&B AMA for anyone on the R&B who wants to ask me questions. I want to make myself available to them so that they know what's going on and they can be engaged with. And I think it's important for the delegate to not only have a presence off-site in our community, but have a presence game-side, because game-side is really the crux of people who are generating and spawning nations who don't know any better. They need to be connected to our community still. So I definitely want to make myself available for them. But if you're unable to connect on the forum for whatever reason, maybe you don't have, the ability to, or a residential IP, maybe you can't become a citizen, maybe you can't do this, maybe you can't do that, that's okay, because our community should come to you. And if you're a GameSide nation, we definitely shouldn't forget about you. It's not some random TNT nation because they're not on the forums. No, that's a member of our community. We should value them the same. I'll be making myself available to them for an Ask Me Anything session, questions and answers, and I'll be connecting with them in meaningful ways that let them know that, hey, if I'm elected delegate, I'm going to be here for you, regardless of if you're on our forums or if you're not. And I think that's, that's something that's sorely needed.
Listener asked, how can you ensure that this high energy focused approach will continue throughout the length of the term?
The term, as some people would describe, anyone who's been in the role before, and the reason that I know this is because I talk to former delegates, and I get their insights. Anyone who's been in the role before will tell you that it's hard work. It's definitely not a walk in the park. It's difficult at times, and it really is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's a gauntlet, if you will, to get. Maybe the first 2 months of your term will go by quickly. Maybe the third month will slow down a little, and about the fourth month, you have to run that race. And one thing that you do to make sure that the energy stays consistent throughout is you continue pushing forward, you continue getting people excited, you continue doing things that go above and beyond what people are expecting. One of the reasons that I ran is because I felt that we'd been, just kind of coasting along or going through the motions of doing what TNP government does. Well, let's reimagine that. Let's do things differently. Let's not be afraid to branch out of our comfort zone. Like I said in my campaign, now it's the time for us to step up, branch outside our comfort zone. Let's get started. What you do is you appoint leaders, other ministers, because ministers are leaders. They are leaders. You appoint ministers who share that vision, who share that drive, who share that work ethic, who are going to be there, whether it's June, July, August. You want to appoint people who can be there. You want to appoint people who believe in the same, vision for TNP that you do if you're elected delegate. You definitely want to involve people, make them feel like they have a say. I talked about debate shows. That's one way we can give our citizens a say on our platforms. I talked about, accepting suggestions. I'll even modify my campaign if I get a good suggestion, because I want to make sure that what I'm doing is representative of what all citizens of this region, and even residents, what they want. So I want to be there for them, and I want to make sure that I'm willing to compromise and adapt. So how we keep up that energy is it doesn't always have to be the same set approach. If people respond pleasantly to something, then let's continue doing that. Let's adapt to what people want to do, what people want to see, and you would give that power to them. You empower them to feel like they make a difference, feel like they have a say. Then they're going to be more excited and receptive for what you're doing, and that's just what I believe in.
Okay, we got another question from Westerner. The North Pacific and the MPA as a whole identify as an independent organization that is more neutral on the spectrum on the rating defending spectrum. Would you say you personally have a rating defending leaning? Which way, and if so, which way do you lean?
So I believe this is a question about my own personal take on what I prefer to do in R&D, I believe. Yeah, okay, thank you. Just wanted to clarify so I can answer your question. Personally, I just want to get this out of the way right now. I've been both a defender and a raider at various points during my career in gameplay. I am more skilled as a raider on the R side of things in R&D. I'm more, proficient. I know the tactics. I know what I'm doing, and I generally enjoy it more. But that's not to say that I don't engage with the D part of R&D. It's if you want to look back for documentation of that, check out the reports that I used to do when I was Minister of Defense back in late 2019. We did lots of D tags with proficient defending orgs, such as the Rejected Realms Army, the RRA, SPSF, South Pacific Special Forces, even with our allies in ERN, European Republican Navy. We've been doing D tags even with me at the helm. So even though I personally enjoy one thing more, I will make sure that we stay true to that independent stance and that we don't just become another face in the crowd when it comes to R&D.
Westerner asks another question, and that is, what is your opinion on the balance of the types of operations undertaken by the North Pacific Army this term?
I think that there's a common misconception that because you're independent, you need to evenly balance the types of ops that you do, and that couldn't be further from the truth. There's not an arbitrary quota of, hey, we've done this many R ops for R&D, and we need to do this many D ops for R&D. No, it's not a direct trade-off. It's not 50-50 down the middle. That's not what being independent is about. Independent means that we can defend when it's in our interest to defend and when it's in our allies' interest to defend, and it means that we can raid when it supports our interests or when we find it fun or when it's not being destructive to regions. And I don't think it has to be a definite 50-50 split. So I think that that's the misconception that people have. That, oh, you're independent or oh, you're neutral. You play both sides. No, that's not true. We can do, 4 defending ops and do 6 raiding ops, and there's no problem. 7 raiding ops, Conversely, we can do 8 defending D-tag ops, and we can do 2 raiding ops. That doesn't make us any less independent. Independence is a mindset. It's an approach to things, but it doesn't necessarily mean a 50-50 split. That would be my opinion on that.
Peeps asks, furthering the ideology discussion, how do you view independence and how the North Pacific implements it?
I actually think I kind of, without even reading the question, I kind of think I answered this in Westerners, but for the sake of answering your question, I'll be more than happy to restate it. It's that I really think that independence is an overarching goal. It's not always 50-50, a definite split. It doesn't mean we have to be squarely in the middle. It means that we represent our region and our allies' interests. It means we don't only ally ourselves with a certain ideology. We're not in a certain sphere, if you will, as far as, oh, we only do ops with raiding regions, or oh, we only do ops with defending regions. We can do both. We can be skilled at both, going back to what I talked about in the defense portion of my campaign about versatility and a variety in ops. I definitely think that holds true here. As far as how I view independence, I'm absolutely in favor of it. That's part of our regional identity, and of course, by no means would I seek to change that. I think, personally, I identify as a raider-leaning independent. Notice how I incorporate independent into that, but also raider-leaning. I combine the two. That's just me personally. That isn't what the region is. The region isn't raider-leaning, defending-leaning. It's independent, and that's where it will stay.
Westerner asks, what is your favorite number and why?
I like the number 13 just because it's kind of, I know it's going to sound kind of edgy, but I like the number 13 because it's supposedly unlucky. But I also like the numbers 71 and 99. When I used to play football in high school, I wore the number 99. I was a defensive end. That's a little bit of personal information about Rebs, but I like the number 99. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because, certain athletes in sports that I like are in the 90s as far as numbers. And I wore 71 my first year playing sports. So I like the number 71, 99, and 13, and that kind of covers the reason of why, just because they're personally significant to me in my real life.
Koopa asks, what would you say is the biggest weak point of the North Pacific Army right now?
I think that our biggest weak point is that we have a core group of officers who are leading all of the ops and doing everything, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but there is something wrong with the fact that it's only those people. It's only them kind of facilitating activity, and I think that there needs to be more facilitation of activity from more than one source. Right now, it seems like we have a core group of maybe 2, 3, 4 officers who are leading ops on a regular basis, and we have a group of maybe 6, 7 people who are consistently showing up to ops. I'd like to increase our numbers, number one, and again, that goes back to the proactive recruiting efforts that I'd like to see happen. But we also need to not only cultivate new talent to where they can become officers and introduce that new blood to the officer corps, but we need to engage officers who maybe haven't led an op in a while and say that, hey, you're an officer, you're capable, you can do this. Do you need a refresher? Do you need help? What can we do to help you contribute? Because they are officers. They should absolutely by no means should be removed from their role just because they haven't been leading ops. I don't believe in that. But I think that you can definitely support those people when they are wanting to contribute. Maybe they want to contribute but don't know exactly how to go about it. And hey, you gotta reach out to those people and talk to them, get a sense for their availability. When we can, get more officers doing more things, help more soldiers along to become officers, and even leadership from the generals. Maybe some generals, myself included, need to lead more ops, and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We are leaders in the NPA, and we have, the influence, the power, the authority to make sure that happens. So I definitely think that we should get more than a concentration to a lesser degree of people who are doing things and facilitating activity. I think that's the biggest weakness right now. We have an over-reliance on a few people and an over-concentration on those people to facilitate activity.
Westernor asks, as delegate, what will be your stance on quorum rating?
Quorum rating is effective, that's undeniable, but it's also something that shouldn't be used lightly. I don't want to parrot what MCM said last time he was asked this question, but I'm not opposed to it in theory. But I think in practice it should only be reserved for when it's absolutely necessary, or when other more diplomatic avenues are exhausted, or when we really feel strongly about something, or when it supports regional interest and we want to kind of have that say in the WA. We shouldn't use it sparing. It should be used sparingly. My bad. It should be used sparingly. It definitely isn't something that we should use often, if at all. And if we have other diplomatic avenues to go down, I think that we should prioritize those first as opposed to using quorum rating. But I'm not opposed to it as a concept. And I would authorize it in the scenario that I just described.
Kupa asks, on a larger note of my previous question, and I know you probably said these things in your campaign dispatch, but just to give a TLDR here, what are some of the weak points of the other ministries?
I organized my campaign in alphabetical order. That is going to be the order I'm going to go down. Just for a short TLDR, in cards, certain programs are running, certain programs are not. There's a general sense of confusion. People don't know what's running, what's not, why they're not getting their benefits here, or what's happening with all that. We need to increase communication across all cards players and anyone who's interested to let them know, hey, here's what's running, hey, here's what's not, hey, here's what will be running, hey, here's what will be innovated on. I think that the confusion is really causing some problems, and there needs to be more communication, more structure to that. Some programs need to be revived. Some programs need to say, hey, we're really discontinuing these. But if we discontinue some programs because they won't work anymore, we need to communicate that. Because right now, take the great card giveaway, for example. We have people asking daily, hey, is this still running? And I think that's, the confusion needs to be eliminated. In communications, I think that we were supposed to refocus on TNL. Unfortunately, that didn't end up occurring. I personally believe that the latest TNL wasn't exactly on par or up to code with what we've done previously in TNL. I think if you look at the WA Symposium release that we did, the issue concerning it, and then you look at the Card Symposium, I think it pales in comparison to the one that we've most recently put out. And that really is unfortunate, because TNL should be interesting, exciting to read, something special, something to engage with. I really want to see us refocus on that. But I also think that Polaris, the supposed refocusing on Polaris, just simply hasn't happened. You look at the two articles, I repeat, two articles that we've released for Polaris this entire term. One's a court story, court coverage, and one is a WI Digest. The WI Digest should just be a standard. I don't even consider that really one of the articles for Polaris. It should just be a standard. That and the NPA Bulletin. Everything outside of that, I would say true Polaris-style articles, we've had one this entire term, and if we really want to refocus on that, it needs to be a higher output on that. And I've planned things for communications that's really gonna help with that, getting Polaris out there and making sure that when we do release it, it's timely. Going into culture, I've talked about engaging and stimulating the interest in game side with the Delegates Flag event. I think that right now, culture has been a strong point of this current administration. I think that MedJack has provided excellent leadership along with deputy ministers such as Sarah and Castonvia. Sarah has a really great creative energy. I've witnessed her do culture in TRR, and I know that her and MedJack work excellent as a team. And I'd actually like to see that team continue in culture if they're both up to it. So I really don't see too many issues with culture, but I would like to see more spontaneous activity, and that's something I mentioned in my campaign. Activity that, while not planned, still occurs. Culture really is an energy of its own. It's its own kind of spirit in a way. It doesn't always have to be, hey, here are the planned events. No, let's do things outside of those events. Let's really feel like a community. Let's build a community. Let's get people to interact not only in the game, but outside of the game as community members. And let's get them to enjoy the time they spend together. In home affairs, I feel like doing list for the sake of list isn't working. We need a better approach to that. I talked about splitting the list into two categories. I'm sorry, I know you said TLTR, but I'm very passionate about this. Splitting things into categories to make sure. I think that there's an approach that's necessary when you do lists, not just do lists for the sake of completing them. Going on to the external ministries and defense, obviously, I said we need to find people who are not just going to be one concentrated group of people who are doing activities. That was kind of an extension of your previous question, so I don't feel the need to elaborate since I answered it earlier. In World Assembly Affairs, we have that same problem. A lot of it has been concentrated squarely on the shoulders of Boston Castle. And while I applaud Boston Castle for his initiative, I also think that we need more staffers doing more things. As of right now, as far as I know, all of the IFEs are being written by Boston or Westenor. They're being sent out by Westenor. It's a high concentration on two people, and I'd like to see staffers get more involved. Now I've talked about what I'm going to do to help staffers get involved. I kind of flew out of alphabetical order there. Sorry. Radio, I talked about how we've been kind of over-reliant on the standard interview format for shows, and I think we can do so much better than that. I think that we can introduce new shows to the lineup, so I'm definitely going to do trader spotlights, card farming tutorials, R&D tutorials if we'd like to. RP read-alongs, it's a simple idea that leverages already existing content, so let's do it, let's get it done. And then the last ministry, obviously, that I have to mention is Foreign Affairs. And I talked about, it was very difficult for us. It took longer, I think, than it should have to get the World Factory projects as far as entries fully up to date, or fully completed, but we need to keep them up to date going forward, and we need to make that a living, breathing, if you will, FA report, an ambassadorial report. Ambassadors need to be focused on keeping their entries for their assigned regions updated, and it needs to be something that's constantly evolving so it remains relevant and timely as a resource for people.
Free Talks asks, a minister disappears with no prior warning. How would you handle the situation, and how quickly would you move to replace them?
This is actually something I have experience dealing with. Unfortunately, recently, the deputy speaker of mine, Low2639, did something similar to this, where, when he first disappeared for a couple days, I messaged him, privately, and I said, hey, is anything going on with you that I need to know about? Are you doing okay in real life? When will you be active again? Don't leave us, things of that nature. And he said, I'll be back next week, but unfortunately next week never came, and I did end up having to remove him due to inactivity. And this is unfortunate. I really think that, that communication is valuable. You should contact these people privately, get a feel for their individual situations, because everyone's different, and maybe there's a reason why they're inactive. Maybe a tragic real life event has occurred. I know that people have things that are going on this time of year, graduations, summer camp plans, things of that nature. So we really want to address the situation calmly, but also, again, back to my leadership style, be very clear with what you want them to, be doing. And if through that conversation it's found out that they are not going to be able to do that, or that it's impossible for them, then that's the time where you say, hey, would you mind resigning? And, ideally, at that point, if we had that conversation with one another privately and they said, hey, sure, I can resign, I would offer them the opportunity to resign first and exit the office, with that courtesy. But if they, at that point, were to refuse to resign, then I would unfortunately be forced to remove them, because we need people who are willing to contribute that energy, and I can't have ministers on my administration who aren't active. So I would approach it calmly, with respect to their individual situations, but I'd also be very clear with what I'm wanting from them, and we would determine if they're able to meet that. If they're not able to meet that, then they don't need to be on my cabinet.
Westerner asks, I'm sorry, Westerner's current question is making me crack up a little, but
I'm glad there's plenty of questions.
Yes. Westerner's past question, what is your opinion on the current benefits for ministers, and why do you think I deserve another private jet made out of solid gold?
See, West Sonora is best Sonora. She absolutely deserves a private jet made out of gold. Why not? Add that. Let's raise spending in the RA to fund your private jet. No, let's not do that. But really, realistically, I think, for example, with cards rewards, let's talk about that. There's a reason that deputy ministers and ministers aren't rewarded the same way that staffers are, and it's because I feel like, in a way, people are expecting ministers and deputy ministers to take on that responsibility willfully, not because they're getting rewarded. And I think that sort of thinking holds true. But I also think that, benefits can come in various forms. Maybe you take pride in helping your community. Maybe you feel like you've really made an impact, and I think you can derive a sense of pride out of that, pride of and enjoyment out of that. So I think that's a benefit to being a minister, because it's showing other people, hey, I didn't have to do this, but I still am because I care. And I think that there's definitely a sense of pride and happiness in that.
Three Talks asks, what is your opinion on the interregional chat, and where do you see it going during your term?
This is something, obviously, that I wasn't privy to the conversations of it developing beyond anything that was mentioned in the Senior Diplomats channel, which I do check regularly. But as far as, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the delegates setting it up with fellow regions, I'm not privy to those. Those were above my pay grade, if you will. But the interregional chat, obviously, it's experienced activity in the first part of its existence, and while I can't state clearly if that activity will continue, I will say that I will be a voice for the continuation of that if others are interested in it. I definitely, as delegate, would be engaging there myself because that's something we have a vested interest in. So as delegate, I by virtue of that would also have a vested interest in it if it continues.
Kretox asked another question, and that is, do you believe that Donald Trump is a flat earth?
No. I'm not delving into that, but no.
Good. Good. Kretox then asks, do you plan to retain any of the current delegate directives? Do you plan to modify any of them?
So actually, if you don't mind, I will bring up the delegate directives page real quick, just so I can give you as specific an answer to this as possible, as opposed to a blanket statement. So the current delegate directives we have, as I'm looking at the thread right now, is we have a delegate directive that was canceled out, so that one doesn't apply. We have one relating the government to the North Pacific University. Luckily, that's been rebranded as the Community Center, and I know that's something that communications has been proactive in, so I'm unsure of exactly the text of this, but we definitely reevaluate that with its rebranding as the Community Center and see if it still needs this directive. That's something I would take into consideration. North Pacific Cards Guild directive, I don't see anything wrong with that. Executive Government Activity directive, I think this is something that was more for MCM personally for his term. He likes the idea of organized succession. I've never seen it used, but then again, since I'm not in the Executive Council, I am not privy to if it's been used. I don't believe so. So I'm not sure if it's exactly necessary, but it does provide some structure in the instance of. And while I don't ever see myself going inactive during this term or not being available, I guess it's there. I'm not sure if it's necessary, but it is there. Leadership of the North Pacific Army, that replaced the NPA Code of Governance. That works just fine, I believe. Thread creation for WA voting policy. Here's the thing with the thread creation directive and WA voting policy. I actually mentioned this in my campaign. We have dispatches that are inconsistent with that delegate directive. We have a pinned thread in the WA subforum that is inconsistent with that directive. One of two things needs to happen. Either we need to make changes to that policy, or we need to just update the other places that the policy is mentioned with that delegate directive. But we can't have the inconsistency of it being different in some places. So that's what I'd say as far as the directives.
Kretox asks another question, which is, under what circumstances would you appoint a deputy minister directly?
This is also something I've experienced, an interesting phenomenon in which a deputy minister can be a government official. Because when I was appointed as a deputy minister of Home Affairs, I was actually not appointed by Marcus Antonius. I was appointed directly by Alfigi Grande, which, since I was appointed by an elected official, made me a government official because legal reasons. I really don't think that there's a need for me to directly appoint a deputy minister, and there wouldn't have been a need for Fiji to directly appoint deputy ministers if Marcus had been more active and more reachable at the time. I think that's really the only situation that would call for it, if a minister is unavailable to do it. But everyone that I'm appointing to my cabinet, if I'm elected, will be active, so there won't be a need for me to do that. And if they're not active, then it goes back to what I talked about if they're needing to be removed or not.
Westonor asks, are you a plant?
No.
Koopa asks, can you upgrade I'm sorry. Koopa asks, can you upgrade the Deputy Minister of Defense office from a broom closet to a cubicle?
Sure, giving you a cubicle would mean you'll do more paperwork for me, so that would work out nicely. I'm willing to make that investment.
And Kratox asked, would you see Regional Assembly border control authorization for any security counselors who don't currently have it?
We actually have Ghost in the chat right now. I'm not sure if he's listening, but Ghost, could you quickly tell me if you have SC or RA authorization to hold it? Because I know you've been appointed as an officer before as a security counselor, but I'm unsure if you had border control for it. I believe you did, so I don't think the RA you'd need extra RA authorization because I think you already have it. But I would like to have us have at least one SCer who does have BC authorization, not only just to promote the idea that hey, the SC can still I don't know. It's just a way for them to have peace of mind that hey, the delegate's not the only one. So it kind of eases any concerns like oh, if anything bad were to happen or if anyone goes rogue or anything, there's a security council readily available to deal with that. I'm perfectly fine with giving those who already have RA border control. I'd like to give one SCer, whether that be Palath or I think GBM also had it. I'm perfectly fine with giving them one RO spot, but I think one RO spot is all we can afford because we're very close to the maximum amount of ROs allowed in the region. But I'd be perfectly fine if he's willing to act with border capacity on site, border control capacity.
Kratox asks, will you tweak the current regional officer format?
Will I tweak it? So this is a question that I kind of thought about maybe a day or two ago about if I'm delegate, what powers, in-game powers, am I able to give various ROs? I think that there are certain ROs that have powers that they don't necessarily need or use, but I wouldn't obviously change how they're appointed. All ministers would be ROs. I'd probably have the game side advocate still be an RO, and I would have the regional nation obviously because it needs it. And if we have room, one security council preferably, as I previously mentioned. Like roles, for example, like culture, they need the polls ability just for general fun times and general keeping that active front. The Minister of Foreign Affairs obviously needs embassies, but I'm not certain that all ministers need every single power that they have. I'm perfectly fine keeping it the way it is, but that's something I'd evaluate to see if they need it, and if they do need it, what they're going to use it for.
Kratox asks, are you considering appointing game side advocates as regional officers?
Something I've wondered about before, because the LGA obviously is a regional officer, or is in modern practice. And the other GAs, when they're going about enforcing rules and regulations of the RMB, I've always wondered what the mechanism of enforcement for that is, aside from them issuing warnings, but really the way that those warnings are acted upon is through the authority of the LGA and the delegate, if the injection is necessary. I don't think that individual Gs, because again, we're running out of ROs. We don't exactly always have time to give them new things, and so I think that we don't have enough time to give them new things. We don't have enough space for the ROs. So I can't see an instance in which we'd give GAs the RO spot beyond the LGA.
Kratox asks, do you plan to have another nation as a permanent border control officer?
Another nation besides, well, obviously my own if I'm delegate, and I suggested the idea of either GBM or Ghost as an RO, but beyond them, I don't believe so, because appointing anyone else would require RA confirmation. And while we could go down that route, it's on a needed basis. It's not just appointing BC officers for appointing BC officers. So if there's a reason that they need it, and there's a reasonable reason to believe that they would need it, then we can explore that. But as of right now, I don't intend to. No.
Westerner asks, what is one good thing about both of your opponents for the position of delegate?
Let's see. So my other opponent is Fish. One good thing about them is that they interact with the Agora, and they're very present on Discord, and they're a generally familiar face in the community. People know them. People can speak with them. They're readily available, so I think that's something good. You can reach out to them, and you don't really feel intimidated. They're a pretty welcoming presence. A good thing for Namaria, I don't think her work in defense or HA has been, anything bad. So I think she's done pretty well in those roles. And, she showcased some of her talent in that regard to be a facilitator of activities like she was in HA. So I think that's definitely a positive.
And Koopa had answered a question, and a
He asked
few
the question that I.
wait, he already asked. Oh,
Well,
Westerner brought a new question. The
yeah,
question.
The question by Koopa was already answered previously.
Yes. So Westerner's question is: will you jump with us as on an OPs as delegate to help raise morale and whatnot?
I'd like to, but I won't lie to you. I'm deathly terrified of the possibility of accidentally jumping with my main, and that would pose a huge issue if I'm delegate. I would have to make for absolute crystal clear, sure that I'm jumping number one without WA, but I'm also jumping, without it logging me back into my main, because that has happened once or twice before. I'm not afraid to admit. And if I'm delegate, I can't risk that. I would like to for the purposes of morale and solidarity and all of that. But I would have to be absolutely sure that it's not going to accidentally log me back into my main nation, because it does log me in automatically. So I would have to be absolutely sure about that. Otherwise, I would not be willing to risk it. Kretok says he'll just seize power.
All right, everyone. Thanks for coming. I hope this town hall answered some of your questions about Robespierre's campaign, and will help prepare you for the election to come.